It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, and the Jones family was hosting a barbecue in their backyard. Laughter filled the air as friends and neighbors enjoyed the warm weather, sizzling food, and good company. Music played in the background. Kids ran around playing tag, and the scent of grilled ribs wafted through the neighborhood. Everything seemed perfect, except for one thing. Mr. Harris, the neighbor next door, stood by his window, arms crossed, scowling as he watched the gathering. He was not pleased. In fact, he was furious. Every burst of laughter, every sound of joy from the Jones family and their friends seemed to annoy him more. He couldn't believe how loud they were, how they ruined the peace of the neighborhood. With each passing moment, his frustration grew. Something needed to be done. He wouldn't stand for it much longer. Will Mr. Harris finally confront the Jones family? Or will this peaceful barbecue take a drastic turn? If you're as curious as we are about what's going to happen next, be sure to subscribe and click that notification bell so you don't miss the next part of this story. Also, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if you've ever had a neighbor like Mr. Harris, what was your experience like? Stay tuned for more. Mr. Harris had lived in the neighborhood for over 2 decades, proudly thinking of himself as the unofficial mayor of the block. He knew every family, every routine, and had a strict sense of what his quiet street should look like. When the Jones family, a black family, had moved in just a few months earlier, he had barely acknowledged them. In his mind, they didn't fit into his carefully crafted image of what this neighborhood should be. From the day the moving truck had arrived, he'd watched them with suspicion. They were friendly enough, waving at him as they unpacked boxes and settled in. But Mr. Harris never waved back. His gaze would narrow, his thoughts racing. Who are these people? And why here, of all places? He had often grumbled to himself, unwilling to admit that deep down, his problem wasn't just with their presence, but with something much deeper. Now, seeing them host a large barbecue, the sight was almost too much for him to bear. The sound of laughter and music from their backyard cut through his silence like a knife. He could see the neighbors he'd known for years mingling with the Jones family, laughing, shaking hands, and enjoying themselves. Even children he had seen grow up were running through the yard, chasing each other with gleeful shrieks. His neighbors, his street, now seemingly swept into the charm of the newcomers. His fingers drummed irritably on the windowsill as he watched them from his living room window, his face twisted in a frown. Too loud, too many people. Look at them, he muttered under his breath. Every laugh seemed to echo louder in his mind, like a personal offense. His blood boiled. The nerve of them, he growled, watching as more cars pulled up and more guests joined the party. He thought of all the times he had meticulously kept the peace and quiet of the neighborhood intact. He had put so much effort into keeping things just right. And now the Jones family was hosting what felt like a block-wide gathering, shattering his sense of control. His eyes narrowed as David Jones, the father, flipped burgers at the grill, a smile on his face as he handed out plates to guests. The sight of it only fueled Mr. Harris' anger. Who do they think they are? His resentment wasn't just about the noise. Deep down, he knew it. It was about them. In his mind, the Jones family didn't belong, not in his neighborhood. And the fact that they had the audacity to throw a party, as if they were longtime residents, was more than he could tolerate. His knuckles turned white as he clenched his fists. They think they can just take over, he muttered, pacing back and forth, glancing occasionally back out the window. His frustration was bubbling over, his thoughts darkening with every passing second. Something had to be done. This wasn't just a barbecue, it was a violation of the order he had maintained for years. But what would he do? His mind raced, debating his options, but each one seemed more drastic than the last. Confront them directly. Call the police. No, he needed to make a statement, something they wouldn't forget. Unable to contain his frustration any longer, Mr. Harris stormed out of his house. His jaw was clenched, and his fists were tight by his sides as he marched over to the Jones front door. With each step, his anger swelled, pushing him forward, his heart racing. He didn't care about how it would look anymore. He didn't care about the gathering of people, the noise, or the possibility of making a scene. He was done holding it in. His face was flushed, a deep crimson of barely controlled fury, and he raised his fist to the door. The knocks came in rapid, angry bursts, loud enough to cause heads to turn in the backyard as the sound pierced through the music and laughter. Inside, the guests continued laughing and chatting, unaware of the storm brewing just beyond the door. Mrs. Jones, standing near the kitchen, heard the sharp knock and paused. She exchanged a quick glance with her husband, David, sensing something wasn't right. She excused herself from the group, smiling warmly at their guests before walking toward the front door. As she opened it, the sight of Mr. Harris standing there with a fierce glare caught her off guard. Her expression shifted from one of pleasant surprise to confusion and unease as she took in his tense, towering figure, his clenched jaw, and the unmistakable hostility in his eyes. For a moment, there was an awkward silence between them. She stood frozen, her hand still on the doorknob, trying to understand what had brought her neighbor to their doorstep in such an aggressive state. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady but with a note of surprise, sensing the tension radiating from him. Mr. Harris, breathing heavily, seemed to struggle for a second, as if he was deciding whether to unleash the full extent of his frustration. His eyes darted past her, into the house, catching glimpses of the lively gathering behind her, the laughter still echoing faintly from the backyard. "You can help by stopping that racket," he snapped, his voice sharp and cutting. His words carried a weight that made Mrs. Jones' brows furrow. She blinked in surprise at the force of his tone. This neighborhood has always been quiet, and now it's chaos over here, he added, his voice shaking with barely suppressed rage. Mrs. Jones took a breath, trying to keep her composure. She glanced back at the party, where everyone seemed blissfully unaware of the confrontation happening at the front door. She turned back to Mr. Harris, still trying to make sense of his sudden outburst. "I'm sorry if the noise is bothering you, Mr. Harris," she said calmly, though her heart was beginning to race. "We're just having a small barbecue with friends. I can turn the music down if that helps." But her polite tone seemed to fuel his anger even more. His eyes narrowed, his lips tightening as though the simple offer only worsened the situation. "It's not just the music," he snapped again, his voice rising. "There are too many people, too much going on. This isn't how things are done around here." Mrs. Jones' eyes widened, a hint of shock flashing across her face. This wasn't just about a simple noise complaint. There was something deeper in his words, something bitter, and Mrs. Jones could feel it. "You can help by shutting down that loud party." Mr. Harris snapped, his voice harsh and biting. His face was flushed with frustration as he stood rigid on the doorstep. "It's disruptive, and I don't appreciate all these people coming into the neighborhood. This is a quiet area, not a place for your parties." He spat out the last word as if it tasted bitter on his tongue. Mrs. Jones blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the force of his aggression. She could feel the hostility rolling off him in waves. But despite the rising tension, she remained calm, her hands resting gently on the doorknob. Years of dealing with difficult situations had taught her not to let anger sway her. "I'm sorry if the noise is bothering you, Mr. Harris," she said with measured patience, her voice steady and composed. "We're just having a barbecue with some friends. I can turn the music down if that helps." Her response was calm, even kind, but it did nothing to ease Mr. Harris' temper. If anything, her composed demeanor seemed to inflame him even more. His hands twitched, clenched into fists at his sides as he glared at her, feeling his control slip further away. "It's not just the music," he barked, his voice rising as his frustration spilled over. "Look at all the cars parked on the street. All these people coming and going. This isn't the kind of place for that. You don't get to just changed the whole neighborhood. Mrs. Jones could hear the weight behind his words, the unspoken accusation. It wasn't just about the barbecue, and it wasn't just about the noise or the guests. There was something deeper brewing beneath his complaints, something she could sense, but hadn't quite named. She took a steadying breath, her eyes softening as she looked at him. "We're all neighbors, Mr. Harris," she said gently, hoping to ease the tension. "We've always respected the peace of this community, and we don't want to disrupt that. But we also believe in enjoying time with friends and family. We'll turn the music down, and if the cars are an issue, we can ask our guests to park further down the street." Her words were reasonable, but Mr. Harris wasn't ready to listen. His resentment had festered for too long, and her calmness only highlighted how out of control he felt. His world, his neighborhood, was slipping away from the rigid order he had clung to. And this family, this party, was the tipping point. The tension hung heavy in the air as Mr. Harris stood there, visibly fuming, while Mrs. Jones remained poised and unshaken. What would you do if you were in Mrs. Jones' shoes? How would you handle a neighbor like Mr. Harris? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear how you'd approach this situation. Mr. Harris stormed off, furious as he made his way back to his house. He had no intention of continuing the argument. As he stepped inside, his frustration boiled over. He went straight for his phone, determined to put an end to the situation next door. Without hesitating, he dialed 911. When the call connected, he took a deep breath and tried to mask his anger with a tone of false concern. "I'd like to report a disturbance," he began, his voice steady but cold. "There's a large group of people at my neighbor's house. It's loud, and there are a lot of unfamiliar faces. Frankly, I don't feel safe." The dispatcher, unaware of the true nature of Mr. Harris' grievances, listened attentively and began taking down the details. "Can you provide the address?" they asked. Mr. Harris quickly gave the address, making sure to add, "It's been going on for hours now. I'm worried about what might happen with all these people here." The dispatcher reassured him that officers would be sent to check out the situation and advised him to stay inside if he felt unsafe. As Mr. Harris hung up the phone, he felt a sense of satisfaction. He watched the gathering from his window, waiting for the flashing lights of the police to arrive, convinced he had taken control of the situation. Back at the barbecue, the Jones family and their guests remained completely unaware of what Mr. Harris had done. Then suddenly, the wail of sirens pierced through the chatter, cutting through the joyful noise like a knife. The sound grew louder, and heads turned as two police cars slowly pulled up in front of the house, their lights flashing red and blue. "That's him," Mr. Harris yelled, his voice echoing sharply across the quiet street. He pointed an accusing finger at David Jones. "That's the one hosting this disruptive party. He's ruining the peace of this neighborhood." The officers turned their attention to Mr. Harris, their expressions shifting from casual to puzzled. They exchanged glances, trying to make sense of the outburst. "Afternoon, officers," David said, his tone easy and casual. "What seems to be the problem?" One of the officers, a younger man who had been on the force for only a few years, blinked in surprise when he recognized the man standing in front of him. "Chief Jones?" he asked, clearly caught off guard. His partner, an older officer, exchanged a quick glance with him, also realizing who they were dealing with. "Yes, that's me," David said with a slight chuckle, sensing the officer's unease. "What brings you out here today?" The younger officer cleared his throat, glancing down at the notepad in his hand. "We received a call about a disturbance at this address. The caller mentioned loud noise and too many people. Said they felt unsafe." David, standing beside them, maintained his calm demeanor. He glanced over at Mr. Harris with a mixture of pity and understanding. He had anticipated this confrontation, knowing that Mr. Harris was unlikely to back down easily. "This is a family barbecue, Mr. Harris," David said, his voice even and measured. "There's no disruption, no threat to the peace. We've already checked and confirmed that everything is in order." Mr. Harris' face turned a deeper shade of red as he struggled to find words. The police officer's dismissal of his claims only added to his growing embarrassment. The realization that his complaint was being disregarded was a bitter pill to swallow. His attempt to control the situation had backfired, leaving him exposed and frustrated. But the noise," Mr. Harris stammered, grasping at his original complaints. "The music, the people, it's not right." The older officer, clearly trying to diffuse the situation, spoke with a calming tone. "We understand you're concerned, but we've assessed the situation. It's a normal neighborhood gathering. There's no need for further action." David smiled knowingly, shaking his head slightly. "I see. Well, as you can see, there's no disturbance here. Just a family barbecue. Nothing out of the ordinary." He gestured toward the backyard, where the guests had resumed chatting, though the air was still thick with curiosity about the presence of the police. The older officer, who had served under David during his previous post, gave a brief nod, clearly understanding the situation. "It seems like everything's in order here, Chief. We don't need to intrude any further." David stepped aside, extending his hand toward the yard. "Feel free to take a look around if you'd like. You're welcome to join us for some ribs too," he added with a lighthearted grin. The officers exchanged amused glances, visibly relaxing now that the situation was clear. They knew there was no need for further inspection, and certainly no need for alarm. "No need, sir," the older officer said, tipping his hat slightly in respect. "We trust your word. We'll just make a note that the situation is under control and head back out." David nodded. "Thanks for coming out, officers. I appreciate it." Mr. Harris' failed attempt to disrupt their gathering had only highlighted his own intolerance and prejudice, exposing the true nature of his complaints to everyone who had witnessed the scene. "That's not the point," Mr. Harris fumed, his frustration bubbling over. "This kind of thing doesn't belong here. You should be." "Mr. Harris," David interjected, his voice cutting through the tension. He turned to face his neighbor, his demeanor calm but resolute. "I'm David Jones, the new police chief, and this is my home. There's no law against hosting a barbecue with friends." Mr. Harris' face turned in pale shade, his eyes widening in shock. You're the police chief." "That's right," David confirmed, his tone steady and unyielding. The truth of David's position settled heavily in the air, starkly contrasting with Mr. Harris' anger. The revelation struck Mr. Harris like a thunderbolt. He had just called the police on the very man who now led the local police department. The realization hit him hard, causing his face to drain of color. He stood there, rooted to the spot, his mouth moving silently as he struggled to find the right words. The weight of his actions bore down on him, leaving him feeling exposed and deeply uncomfortable. David maintained his composure throughout the tense silence. "Mr. Harris, if you have a problem with me or my family, you can always come talk to us directly. We're part of this community too. But calling the police for something like this, that's not how we solve things around here." Mr. Harris looked down, the gravity of his actions settling in. His initial anger had melted into a deep sense of regret and embarrassment. He mumbled an apology, barely audible, as he shuffled back to his porch, avoiding eye contact. Mrs. Jones stood nearby, her heart swelling with pride and support for her husband. She recognized the difficulty of maintaining composure in such a high-pressure situation, especially given David's role as the new police chief. She gave him a subtle, encouraging nod, acknowledging the strength it took to face such hostility with grace. David responded with a small, appreciative smile, knowing that his calm demeanor had been crucial in diffusing a potentially volatile situation. The guests, reassured by David's handling of the matter, gradually returned to their conversations, and the festivities resumed. The atmosphere, though slightly altered, remained warm and supportive. Mr. Harris, realizing the depth of his misjudgment and the embarrassment he had brought upon himself, mumbled a few words under his breath that were barely audible. His anger had fizzled into a mixture of shame and frustration. Feeling like he had made a complete fool of himself, he turned and walked back to his house with quick, unsteady steps. David watched as Mr. Harris retreated, his face set in a thoughtful expression. He understood that this incident wasn't necessarily the end of the matter. The community's underlying tensions and prejudices wouldn't disappear overnight. However, for now, the immediate crisis had been averted, and the celebration could continue. If you've enjoyed this story and want to see more like it, be sure to subscribe to our channel, click the notification button, and share this with your friends. We'd love to hear your thoughts and the lessons you've learned from this story in the comments below.